Hello, everyone. I'm John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm joined today by Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation, also at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you, John. I'm excited to be here.
So we are in the midst of, or at the tail end of, the 158th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the tail end of last week, Jake did a live stream about medical care provided at the battle. We're going to do something a little more reflective today. We're going to dive into official reports and accounts, primary sources, and we're going to read them in their entirety. It should be kind of a fun little exercise, a little bit different than the programming that we usually do. So we'll get to that in just a moment. If you're watching this, one of the ways that you can help support us, it's really easy. I promise it will only take 1 or 2 seconds of your time. Just hit the like button on this video. That's all you have to do. And even just by doing that, if everyone watching does that, that helps us a great deal. And it boosts the engagement, helps other people see it, helps it kind of help other people come across the video. It's all very helpful for us. So if you could like the video, and if you want to go above and beyond the call of duty, you can share the video. That is also extraordinarily helpful for us. So every little bit helps. Doing that easy, it's free, it's quick. If you want to go even a step further to helping us out, we have been doing a fundraising campaign. We've been calling it our Hope Through History campaign. We've raised a good bit of money already. And we'll have a link for that in the comments, or you can go to civilwarmed.org/support, and you can find more information about it there. Donating to that, even as little as $5, $10, really helps us out. Or if you want to give $500 or $1,000, we wouldn't turn that down either. But if you've enjoyed these videos, that money goes directly towards supporting these videos. COVID has been challenging for not just museums, but businesses everywhere. And so if you can give a little, that'll help us out a lot. And of course, as we're coming down to the end of the year, your gifts are tax deductible. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. Even though we have national in our name, we are a private nonprofit. So it's all tax deductible. So there is that. So we hope in the spirit of giving this holiday season that you might be able to give a little bit. Helps us out a great deal. So with all that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jake. Jake's going to get us started with some primary sources relating to Confederate medical care at the Battle of Fredericksburg.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John, and great job introducing our video. Just to reiterate what John said, you can help us by liking the video, sharing the video, donating. All of those things help us and allow us to do what we do and continue to bring you content like this. So if you're watching this, we have just finished up the 158th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and you will have noticed that our Facebook page and social media is going to be full of stories related to the medical history of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And this is going to be a tremendous opportunity to learn more about this particular battle. I have recorded a video on Friday that was a live video all about these kinds of stories, looking at how the Battle of Fredericksburg played out in a medical capacity. And as part of that, some of the documentation that I was going through came from the surgeon who is in charge of the medical department for the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army that fights at Fredericksburg, that gains a tremendous victory at Fredericksburg. And that is a guy named Lafayette Guild, who is a fascinating character. You've heard about us if you've watched, you've heard about him if you've watched any of our other videos, especially about Manassas, 2nd Manassas. He is the medical director of the Confederate Army that fights there as well. And so we're going to take a look at the reports that he is writing as the Battle of Fredericksburg is ongoing. We're going to take a look at what he's writing. Now, what's interesting about Guild's reports from Fredericksburg that are collected in the medical and not the medical and surgical history, but the official records of the War of the Rebellion, is that they are contemporary to the battle. These are actually reports that are written to the Surgeon General in Richmond as the battle is ongoing. And so you're going to hear that in these two reports that he is going to put together. It's going to be a little different when John gets to Jonathan Letterman's reports, which are he reports in part just after the battle, but then reflects years later on what happened at Fredericksburg. These are very much as this is happening. Guild is writing these reports. So we'll get started with the first one here that is written from a camp near Fredericksburg, Virginia, December 12th, 1862. This is written to Surgeon General Samuel Preston Moore in Richmond. Sir, the battle commenced yesterday and is still raging. The armies are fighting with the river between them. The railroad is not under control of the military authorities. We have not more than 100 wounded as yet. The ambulance committee, composed of citizens of Richmond, have offered their services, and every facility will be attended to them from the medical, quartermasters, and commissary departments. Some definite and well-regulated system of railroad transportation should be adopted for the wounded. All the farmhouses in this vicinity are filled with poor refugees from the bombarded town of Fredericksburg, and our limited transportation has precluded our having a sufficiency of tents. Therefore, it will be necessary to have the wounded rapidly conveyed to Richmond after the primary operations have been performed. It would relieve me of a great additional trouble and responsibility if you would assign some officer to the special duty of directing the transportation of wounded on the railroad and their proper care in transitu. A fixed schedule of time for running should be adopted. Everything portends a bloody battle. Our ambulance wagons will, no doubt, be sufficient to remove the wounded from the field to the infirmaries, and from the infirmaries to the railroad depot. Herbig reported with 38 ambulances. Our whole army is concentrated in this immediate vicinity. I believe the medical department is in excellent condition. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, L. Guild, Surgeon and Medical Director, Army of Northern Virginia. So he writes that on December 12th, 1862, so the midst of the battle, the massive fight of December 13th at Marie's Heights and south of Fredericksburg has not yet happened. That is still yet to come, but there has been fighting already over the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, and the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, has gained a foothold in the town of Fredericksburg when Guild is writing this. So much of the main bloodshed has not yet occurred. But you can already see that Guild is making those preparations and putting in motion the system that will carry Confederate wounded from Fredericksburg to Richmond. Behind Fredericksburg is a railroad, a rail line that does go on to the Confederate capital from Fredericksburg to Richmond, and that's what he's referring to. And that is going to become the lifeline for Confederate wounded at Fredericksburg, is going to be that rail link. So he is going to write another dispatch, another report to Surgeon General Moore the next day on December 13th, 1862. This is the famous Marie's Heights fighting. This is where Confederate forces are going to absolutely slaughter Army of the Potomac forces who are trying to attack on open ground heading uphill. It's going to be a devastating defense that the Confederates are going to put on and really maul General Burnside's Army of the Potomac. But this is what Lafayette Guild writes on December 13th, 1862, as that fighting is beginning and then ongoing. He says, "Sir, the battle continued yesterday until noon. Since then, all is very quiet. The enemy have crossed the river in strong force at several points and are moving on our right. I think this will be one of the bloodiest fights of the war. Our men are in fine condition and fight with great bravery, bearing their sufferings from wounds with great fortitude and heroism. There are many complaints about the manner in which railroad trains are managed. I am not, however, prepared to report that the fault lies with the director of the road. The ambulance committee have reported to me, and I have pointed out to them the positions in which I think they will be of most service. On the battlefield, they will be in the way, besides being unnecessarily exposed. Let them receive the wounded at the railroad depot from the field infirmaries and provide for them in transitu to General Hospital. I enclose you a copy of my letter to Mr. Enders, chairman of that committee. I have furnished the committee with some of the portable soup meat for trial, and if it makes palatable diet for the wounded, I would advise them to procure a large quantity. Most of our wounded are thus far from Jackson's corps. His medical officers are busily engaged day and night, and if the battle continues, it will be necessary that, for their relief, the number be increased. Our loss up to the time, I do not think, exceeds 2,000. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, L. Guild. So he's writing that as fighting is going on just outside of Fredericksburg, where, as he mentioned, Jackson, Stonewall Jackson is stationed outside of the town. Some Confederate forces are actually briefly overrun there by attacking Union forces. And then in the afternoon, Guild would have been a witness to a larger, much larger Union assault on the Confederate defense at Marye's Heights. That is going to essentially double the casualties that Guild reports in this report. Ultimately, Lafayette Guild does not write a report of the medical department and what they do at the Battle of Fredericksburg in the aftermath of the battle. We only have in the records his kind of contemporary accounting of what is going on. What he ultimately sends in January of 1863 is a list of casualties for each of the brigades that fights in the Army of Northern Virginia. And ultimately, the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg is going to report casualties at about 5,300, of which about 4,100 were wounded in the fighting. Compare this to the Union Army, which John's going to talk about in just a bit. The casualties are extremely small, and this reflects the fighting that was going on. Confederate forces entrenched essentially behind very strong natural defensive positions, taking up ground there that was very easily defensible, famously the sunken road, stone wall at Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg. This is reflected in the casualty figures that we see, and that Guild ultimately reports to the Surgeon General. Now, there's another letter that comes, this is in the aftermath of the fight at Fredericksburg. This is again in January of 1863 that I thought would be interesting to include in this. Now, it's not directly Fredericksburg related, but it is close enough that there are references to the Battle of Fredericksburg in this report, but it's much more relevant to our current time period, specifically as it comes to disease as being spread from person to person in the Army of Northern Virginia. So this is a letter that is written January 9th, 1863, which January 9th is my birthday. This is written January 9th, 1863 by Lafayette Guild to the Surgeon General, Samuel Preston Moore. Sir, herewith I transmit the consolidated monthly report of sick and wounded, and the monthly return of medical officers of this army for the month of November 1862, together with the list of casualties in the Battle of Fredericksburg. This list is considerably larger than was at first estimated. At present, there are about 60 cases of variola and varioloid in this army. These cases have invariably occurred among the men who have recently returned to duty from the general hospitals, particularly from Richmond. Could not a system of quarantine be adopted by which the soldiers returning to duty from general hospitals might be retained sufficiently long to ensure any immunity from the contagion? I believe our exemption from a fearful epidemic of smallpox is owing to our present mode of life, viz. Bivouacking in the open air. When we go into winter quarters, I fear the health of the troops will not remain so good. There is a tendency of scorbutus throughout the whole army. Unless there is an increase of the vegetable portion of the ration, scurvy must make its appearance. None of the component parts of the ration except flour and unsmoked bacon, with beef occasionally, of inferior quality are issued. Vinegar and potatoes are absolutely necessary for the maintenance of the health of the troops, and I would most respectfully request you to impress it upon the subsistence department that our next campaign be a disastrous one simply for the want of anti-scorbutics. The condition of the Army of Northern Virginia is remarkably fine, and nothing is needed so much as proper food to complete its efficiency. I enclose a rough draft of orders or regulations intending for promoting the general efficiency of our department in the field, and you may give this your consideration. After mature reflection, I am convinced that many evils now existing will be corrected by its adoption. This paper has been submitted to General Lee and meets with his unqualified approval. Should you deem it necessary to incorporate it in medical regulations, the General is still desirous of having its requirements adopted for the guidance of this Army, and has instructed me to furnish him with the number and names of medical officers who are to constitute the members of the staff corps of the medical department of the Army of Northern Virginia. When this is accomplished, an additional number of about 40 medical officers will be required, and I would respectfully request that the same number, if available, be ordered to report to me with as little delay as practicable. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, L. Guild. So in there we get a little bit of, attaching the casualty list from Fredericksburg. We get a discussion about smallpox, which again is particularly relevant for our time period today. Richmond was in the winter of 1862 to 1863 having a particularly nasty smallpox epidemic, which is going to see much of the Confederate government, many elements of the Army as well, vaccinated against smallpox. So that is something that is going on while Guild is writing this particular report. He also describes the scurvy that is rampant in the Army of Northern Virginia as well. So even after a great victory like the Confederate forces are going to have at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, they still are suffering from these issues of health that are going to plague them throughout the war, just based on the access to resources that they have available. But you do see in this report and in this primary document that they are taking steps to try to alleviate some of those issues. So that is the story from the Confederate side of things, and I'll throw it back over to John for the Union side.
Yeah, before I dive into that, just a couple things that really struck me from what you just read, Jake. Number one, and we see this with Letterman as well, but just especially in that very first selection you read, the dedication and the large perspective of these medical directors, thinking not just about the casualties they already have, but preparing for casualties they know will come. It reminds me, of the way that, some of the ways in which we've tackled the COVID pandemic today. It's all about, making sure that there is enough room in the hospitals. That kind of larger perspective that medical directors need to have. People kind of moving patients here and there, like we got to move these patients soon because we're going to have more soon after that. And so it's in its own way kind of strikingly modern. As I was hearing you read it, I thought that was fascinating. And the other thing that struck me in the most recent thing that you read about, that Lafayette Guild wrote about, the spread of disease and stuff, people often, say how, one of the common, I think, misconceptions people have about Civil War medicine, about, how they didn't really know anything, they weren't that good at their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, we debunk that here on this on this channel on a pretty regular basis, but that shows to me that they're even close to kind of getting to germ theory. Like, they kind of roughly understand how this all works. They just don't, they're missing like a final few pieces. And there are just so many moments where whenever I'm doing research, I'm like, wow, Civil War medicine's pretty modern. But don't get the wrong impression. It's definitely not modern medicine. But if you squint at it a little bit, you can really see some interesting connections to today.
Yeah, that passage in particular, talking about cases of smallpox being in the Army as a result of people coming from an area where there was an outbreak and bringing it into the Army, and those that didn't have immunity to it yet being exposed. All of that, essentially those two paragraphs, very much shadow our own time period today, and they are taking steps that we are still taking today, that we are still required. And this is just the condition of dealing with infectious diseases like smallpox or COVID, that the methodology in dealing with that, when you don't have a cure, you have steps you can take, especially now that we are having a vaccine for COVID. The steps that you have to take in the meantime are the same. And there's, again, that connection, that past to present relevancy that we always focus on here at the museum. You see it right here in this report from January of 1863, written in practically the same language that we speak 158 years later.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. So I wanted to point that out. So now we're going to get into the Union perspective here. So I'm going to read two separate documents written by Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Union Army of the Potomac. The first is actually from the tail end of his report for the Battle of Antietam, and it talks about the lead up to Fredericksburg, some of the measures that he takes. So this is written in March of 1863, talking about preparation for Fredericksburg. And then once we go through that, I'll read a selection from his memoir that was published in 1866, where he details events at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So starting with his official report, and the battle that he's talking about, the most recent one in this case, is the Battle of Antietam. So this is between Antietam and Fredericksburg here. In making such changes as experience and observation during those battles and the short time that I had occupied the position of medical director convinced me were necessary to render the medical department more efficient. Hitherto, large amounts of medical supplies had been lost and in various ways wasted, and not unfrequently all the supplies for a regiment had been thrown away for want of transportation, and of course were not on hand when wanted. It was necessary that this should be remedied, and in order to do so, it was necessary to diminish the amount that was furnished a regiment at one time, which would affect the whole existing system and make the change a radical one. The objects which it was considered as desirable to attain were to reduce the waste which took place when large supplies were at one time issued to regiments, to have a supply given them, small but sufficient for all immediate wants, and to have these supplies easily obtainable and replenished without difficulty when required, and without a multiplicity of papers and accounts. It was necessary also that they should be transported with facility, and that no trouble should be experienced in having them in abundance at the field hospitals in time of action, and yet at the same time to preserve a proper degree of accountability. To accomplish this, a system of supplying by brigades was adopted on the 4th of October, 1862. The following extract from a circular issued to the medical department of this army at that date from the medical director's office will show the main features of the system which since that time has been in existence in this army. Hereafter, in the Army of the Potomac, the following supplies will be allowed to a brigade for 1 month for active field service, viz. 1 hospital wagon, filled, 1 medicine chest for each regiment, filled, 1 hospital knapsack for each regimental medical officer, filled, supplies in the list marked A to be transported in a 4-horse wagon. The surgeon in charge of each brigade will require and receipt for all these supplies, including those in the hospital wagons, and will issue to the senior surgeons of each regiment the medicine chests and knapsacks, taking receipts therefor. The hospital wagon with its horses, harnesses, etc. will be receipted for by the ambulance quartermaster. The surgeon in charge of the brigade will issue to the medical officers of the regiment such of these supplies as may be required for their commands informally, taking no receipts, demanding no requisitions, but accounting for the issues as expended. The surgeons in charge of brigades will at once make out requisitions in accordance with these instructions and transmit them, approved by the medical director of the corps, to the medical purveyor of this army. These supplies being deemed sufficient for 1 month only, or for an emergency, medical directors of corps will see that they are always on hand, timely requisitions being made for that purpose. For the adoption of this system, 1 and sometimes 2 wagons were required to transport the medical supplies of a regiment, and in addition, another wagon was required to transport cooking utensils, hospital tents, baggage of medical officers, etc. With this system, 1 wagon suffices for the medical department of a regiment. 1 wagon is added to a brigade, and at least 1 taken from each regiment. And besides, should it become necessary to take away this 1 wagon from a regiment, the supplies are in such shape as will permit them to be carried on a horse and not necessarily lost as heretofore. The regimental surgeons have no trouble in replenishing their supplies, and the amounts expended in a regiment are always known to the surgeon-in-chief of a brigade, whose duty it is to always check any undue waste or improper expenditure. These supplies are easily transported and are without difficulty made available on the field of battle, as events which have since transpired have demonstrated. These instructions having been issued, my attention was given to the manner in which the wounded were attended to upon the field of battle. No system of field hospitals that I was aware of existed, and convinced of the necessity of adopting some measures by which the wounded could receive the best surgical aid which the Army afforded, and with the least delay, my thoughts were naturally turned to this most important subject. On the field of battle, confusion is, above all other places, most prone to ensue, and unless some method is observed by which certain surgeons have specific duties to perform, and every officer has his place pointed out beforehand, and his duties defined, and held to a strict responsibility for their proper performance, the wounded must, of course, suffer. To remedy the want which existed, the following circular was issued. Circular. Headquarters, Army of the Potomac, Medical Director's Office, October 30, 1862. Sir, in order that the wounded may receive the most prompt and efficient attention during and after an engagement, and that the necessary operations may be performed by the most skillful and responsible surgeons at the earliest moment, the following instructions are issued for the guidance of the medical staff of this Army, and medical directors of corps will see that they are promptly carried into effect. Previous to an engagement, there will be established in each corps a hospital for each division, the position of which will be selected by the medical director of the corps. The organization of the hospital will be as follows. First, a surgeon in charge, one assistant surgeon to provide food and shelter, etc., one assistant surgeon to keep the records. Second, 3 medical officers to perform operations, 3 medical officers as assistants to each of those officers. Third, additional medical officers, hospital stewards, nurses of the division. The surgeon in charge will have general superintendents and be responsible to the surgeon-in-chief of the division for the proper administration of the hospital. The surgeon-in-chief of a division will detail 1 assistant surgeon who will report to and be under the immediate orders of the surgeon in charge, whose duties shall be to pitch the hospital tents and provide straw, fuel, water, blankets, etc., and when houses are used, put them in proper order for the reception of the wounded. This assistant surgeon will, when the foregoing shall have been accomplished, at once organize a kitchen, using for this purpose the hospital mess chests and the kettles, tins, etc. in the ambulances. The supplies of beef stock and bread in the ambulances and of arrowroot, tea, etc. in the hospital wagon will enable him to prepare quickly a sufficient quantity of palatable and nourishing food. All the cooks and such of the hospital stewards and nurses as may be necessary will be placed under his orders for these purposes. He will detail another assistant surgeon whose duty it shall be to keep a complete record of every case brought to the hospital, giving the name, rank, company, and regiment, the seat and character of injury, the treatment, the operation, if any be performed, and the result, which will be transmitted to the medical director of the corps and by him sent to this office. This officer will also see to the proper interment of those who die, and that the grave is marked with a headboard with the name, rank, company, and regiment legibly inscribed upon it. He will make out 2 tabular statements of wounded, with the surgeon-in-chief of division will transmit within 36 hours after a battle, one to this office by a special messenger if necessary, and the other to the medical director of the corps to which the hospital belongs. There will be selected from the division by the surgeon-in-chief under the direction of the medical director of the corps 3 medical officers who will be the operating staff of the hospital, upon whom will rest the immediate responsibility of the performance of all important operations. In all doubtful cases, they will consult together, and a majority of them shall decide upon the expediency and character of the operation. These officers will be selected from the division without regard to rank, but solely on account of their known prudence, judgment, and skill. The surgeon-in-chief of the division is enjoined to be especially careful in the selection of these officers, choosing only those who have distinguished themselves for surgical skill, sound judgment, and conscientious regard for the highest interests of the wounded. There will be detailed 3 medical officers to act as assistants to each of these officers, who will report to him and act entirely under his direction. It is suggested that one of the assistants be selected to administer the anesthetic. Each operating surgeon will be provided with an excellent table from the hospital wagon, and with the present organization for field hospitals, it is hoped that the confusion and the delay in performing the necessary operations so often existing after a battle will be avoided, and all operations hereafter be primary. The remaining medical officers of the division, except 1 to each regiment, will be ordered to the hospitals to act as dressers and assistants generally. Those who follow the regiments to the field will establish themselves, each one at a temporary depot, at such distance or situation in the rear of his regiment as will ensure safety to the wounded, where they will give such aid as is immediately required. And they are here reminded that, whilst no personal consideration should interfere with their duty to the wounded, the grave responsibilities resting upon them render any unnecessary exposure improper. The surgeon-in-chief of the division will exercise general supervision under the medical director of the corps over the medical affairs of his division. He will see that the officers are faithful in the performance of their duties in the hospital and upon the field, and that by the ambulance corps, which has heretofore been so efficient, the wounded are removed from the field carefully and with dispatch. Whenever his duties permit, he will give his professional services at the hospital, will order to the hospital as soon as located all the hospital wagons of the brigades, the hospital tents and furniture, and all the hospital stewards and nurses. He will notify the captain commanding the ambulance corps, or, if this be impracticable, the first lieutenant commanding the division of ambulances, of the location of the hospital. No medical officer will leave the position to which he shall have been assigned without permission, and any officer so doing will be reported to the medical director of the corps, who will report the facts to this office. The medical directors of corps will apply to their commanders on the eve of a battle for the necessary guard and men for fatigue duty. This guard will be particularly careful that no stragglers be allowed about the hospital, using the food and comforts prepared for the wounded. No wounded will be sent away from any of these hospitals without authority from this office. Previous to an engagement, a detail will be made by the medical directors of corps of a proper number of medical officers who will, should a retreat be found necessary, remain and take care of the wounded. This detail, medical directors will request the corps commanders to announce in orders. The skillful attention shown by the medical officers of this army to the wounded upon the battlefields of South Mountain, Crampton's Gap, and the Antietam, under trying circumstances, gives the assurance that, with this organization, the medical staff of the Army of the Potomac can, with confidence, be relied upon under all emergencies to take charge of the wounded entrusted to its care. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Jonathan Letterman, Medical Director. As both of these circulars met the approval of the commanding general and were issued under his auspices, it may not be amiss to say that at the Battle of Fredericksburg, on the 13th of December, 1862, when they were first tried, and when from the nature of the action they were severely tested, they fulfilled in a great degree the expectations hoped for at the time of their adoption. So thus concludes Letterman's report, and now we're going to turn to kind of a more detailed analysis of exactly how those orders that Letterman instituted did prove to be beneficial. So just a quick summary. The first circular was all to ensure that rather than having too many supplies at any given time, the units had a usable number of supplies that were easy to transport to the front lines. And then Letterman gave a detailed organization of what the field hospitals were supposed to look like, notably that they should be chosen in advance of a battle so that they knew where so the ambulance corps knew where to bring the patients, or the patients themselves might know where to go, and all that sort of thing, as well as how they should run, who's doing the operating, all that good stuff. So I'm gonna take a quick drink here. and then I'll forge ahead. So this comes from Letterman's Memoirs, Medical Recollections, published in 1866. The Army crossed the Potomac into Virginia in the later part of October and early in November in the expectation of soon meeting the enemy again. Our cavalry, being in the advance, had daily skirmishes with that of the opposing forces and gave the department a few wounded to provide for. Beyond this, nothing of interest in a medical point of view took place during our very rapid march through this portion of the state. I had made all the arrangements that time permitted to carry out the instructions contained in the system I had established, and with the hearty cooperation given me by the ablest medical officers in the Army, I felt in the event of a battle, this department would be better able than ever to discharge the duties devolving upon it. General McClellan having been relieved, General Burnside assumed command of the Army at Warren's in Virginia on the 9th of November. On the 17th, the Army left for Fredericksburg, Virginia, and on the 19th arrived opposite that city. It was generally believed that we could cross at once the Rappahannock and take possession of the city. It soon became apparent that, should we make the attempt, we would encounter a strong opposition. The great uncertainty that prevailed regarding our movements was not conducive to proper and well-directed exertion. I was busily employed in having my department well prepared and ready for any emergency which might arise. To attain this end, my attention was principally detailed to the instructions of the circulars of October 4th and October 30th, 1862, to see that they were clearly understood and as fully carried out as was possible previous to an engagement. That an extra amount of supplies was in the hands of the purveyor and easily procured, that the ambulance corps should be established in all portions of the Army and perfectly equipped. I directed Assistant Surgeon Thomas McMillan, the medical purveyor, to leave Knoxville, Maryland, as soon as the Army had crossed into Virginia and proceed with his supplies to Washington, there to await orders. Before we reached Warrenton, he was ordered to that place where he was busily engaged in fitting out officers according to the requirements issued on the 4th of October. He was afterwards ordered to the depot at Aquia Creek, where ample supplies had been ordered from New York and elsewhere, which were rapidly issued. I may state here that a sufficient number of hospital wagons could not be procured, nor was it ever in my power to remedy the deficiency in this very important article required by the circular. In addition to the regular supplies, large quantities of beef stock, stimulants, and dressings of all kinds, milk, coffee, tea, blankets, shirts, drawers, etc., were procured and packed, ready to be sent at any moment to such a point as I might direct. The medical directors of corps were informed that these articles had been procured and that in the event of an engagement, they would be brought to an easily accessible point where medical officers could procure all they desired without any formal requisitions, invoices, or receipts, but simply on the written request of the officer. The details required by the circular of October 30th were made, and all possible steps taken to carry the provisions of that order into effect. The ambulance corps throughout the Army was carefully examined. Horses, harnesses, stretchers, lanterns, etc. were procured, and officers assigned and men detailed to complete and render effective this organization. 500 extra hospital tents were ordered at my request by Colonel, now Major General, Ingalls, the chief quartermaster, and kept at the depot ready to be used when I required them. I now felt that when my department should be called upon, everything had been done in the inauguration of the new system to make it equal to the demands which might be made upon it. On the 11th of December, the pontoon bridges were ready to be thrown over the Rappahannock. The positions of the batteries had been selected and the guns placed in position on the north bank of the river. I did not anticipate many casualties among the artillerists and therefore directed only 3 locations to be selected as hospitals for all the wounded. These instructions were carried out and my anticipations regarding the number of wounded were realized. The nature of the impending battle was somewhat peculiar as far as it involved the medical department. In the attempt to lay the bridges over the river in front of the city, determined opposition was to be expected from the enemy, and should the bridges be constructed, the troops would doubtless cross under the fire of the enemy's guns, which were planted on the heights beyond, and commanded the bridges and the streets leading from them into the city. In this case, accommodations must be prepared on the north side of the river for a large number of wounded. Should we succeed in crossing and in taking possession of the city without opposition, in all probability the troops would be immediately pushed on, and the attempt made to dislodge the enemy from the heights, which gave him complete control of the city. In this case, hospitals must be established in Fredericksburg as soon as the troops entered it, and yet it was equally necessary, even if we crossed without molestation, if we failed in carrying the heights, that the wounded should be removed at a moment's notice to the north side of the river beyond the reach of the hostile guns. Preparations were made for these contingencies. The hospitals were formed by divisions as the order required. Surgeons were at their posts ready for duty with their attendants, nurses, food, medicines, and all that the wounded might need. And all the hospitals were in such order as to give the most pleasing assurance of the efficiency to meet the emergencies of the approaching engagement. On the morning of December 11th, the attempt was made to throw the bridges over the river. The artillery opened upon the enemy's works beyond the city, and upon that portion of it which skirted the river, whence the riflemen of the opposing forces were pouring a deadly fire upon the engineers engaged in constructing these bridges. As the day advanced, our fire became more terrific, and late in the afternoon, the enemy, few in number, were driven from the cellars and other places of concealment along the bank of the river. 3 bridges were then speedily thrown over to our right. 2 bridges were constructed on our left wing, where much less opposition was encountered. No serious attempt was made after this to prevent the crossing of the troops, which took place on the evening of the 11th and the following day. The few wounded were speedily and properly attended. In examining that portion of the city in our possession, the enemy still occupying that part of it furthest from the river, on the 12th, to ascertain its capacities for hospital purposes, I was struck by the desolation everywhere visible. The courthouse, several churches, and such other buildings as were suitable were selected by Dr. Dodery, the medical director of the 8th Grand Division, and Dr. Moore, the medical director of the Center Grand Division, and the medical directors of the Corps engaged a sufficient number of hospital wagons sent over, and so earnestly did the medical officers enter upon the discharge of their duties that the hospitals were in readiness with surgeons, attendants, guards, instruments, dressings, stimulants, food, candles, etc. before the action began. The wounded on the north side of the river were left in charge of a sufficient number of medical officers and attendants with plenty of medical and surgical supplies and food. All the hospitals were left standing, and hospital tents were placed in the depot opposite Fredericksburg, ready to be pitched should we require them. The left wing of the army crossed on the same days as the right. Here also hospitals were established on the north side of the river and on the south side, on the south bank. The most sheltered locations were chosen for them. It was found impossible to place them beyond the range of the enemy's guns. Owing to the nature of the action on this part of the field, the medical officers were more able to carry out the hospital organization. In the 6th Corps, each hospital had 3 operating tables with the requisite number of surgeons and attendants assigned to them separately. Instruments, dressings, and all the appliances necessary were arranged with order, precision, and convenience, rarely exceeded in regular hospitals. Each surgeon knew his proper place and devoted himself to the duty pertaining to it with a zeal and fidelity worthy of the highest commendation. I only give you the testimony of commanding officers as well as medical officers when I state to you that the preparations here made in a very short time presented the completeness and detail belonging to long-established hospitals rather than to extemporized field hospitals. And were I to explain in full this organization, I would only be repeating the instructions laid down in the circular to which we strictly adhered. The medical officers detailed to accompany the troops into action were directed to establish themselves in the most accessible and sheltered places in the rear of their respective brigades, where the wounded would be carried by stretcher bearers, who were ordered to keep themselves constantly informed of the position of these officers. Here the wounded would receive such attendance as was imperatively required, after which they would be conveyed to their division hospitals by the ambulances. The fighting on the right would only be a short distance from the city, and the position of the enemy would prevent the use of ambulances during the action. The hospitals in the city were made known to the medical officers accompanying the troops and to the stretcher bearers of the division. Before the action began, the extra supplies heretofore mentioned were brought to the depot near Fredericksburg by the medical purveyor who, in accordance with my wishes, came to see the field operations that he might better execute any orders he might receive in reference to the supplies when he returned to Aquia Creek. The medical directors were informed where these supplies were deposited and were directed to have the information conveyed to all their subordinate officers. The battle began on the morning of the 13th December and lasted until dark. The bearing of the troops on the right was admirable. From the headquarters of General Burnside, they could be seen advancing and driven back by the murderous fire of the enemy. Again and again they reformed and pressed forward over the wounded, the dying, and the dead, close to fortifications, rifle pits, and stone walls, behind which the foe was concealed. Their gallantry and perseverance under circumstances so disheartening, challenging, the admiration of all who watched with intense anxiety the progress of the battle. Throughout the day, the wounded were rapidly brought in and were promptly and efficiently treated. As night closed in, the firing slackened and shortly after ceased. The ambulances, which could not be used while the battle lasted, were now employed in gathering the wounded, numbers of whom then remained upon the field. The night was very dark, and the officers and men of the Corps experienced great difficulty in finding the objects of their search. They could not use their lanterns, as the glimmer of a candle invariably called forth a shot from a sharpshooting picket. They were obliged to grope their way and search for their wounded comrades who lay on the field covered by the fire of the enemy's musketry, which made it hazardous for the wounded or those seeking them to move over that sanguinary ground, even when protected by the darkness. The officers and men of this corps persevered so well, notwithstanding the difficulties which beset them, that before dawn all the wounded who were not beyond our lines were taken to the hospitals prepared for them in the rear. The duties of medical officers, unlike those of the line, did not cease with the close of the day, but continued throughout the night. The hospitals, although located in the most sheltered parts of the city, were not free from danger after dark. Every light reminded the officers of the vicinity of the enemy, and blankets were placed over the windows, and each aperture closed to conceal the lights, every appearance of which drew a shot from the hostile guns planted on the heights beyond. During the day, several hospitals were struck by shot and shell from these guns, but fortunately, no one was injured. The preparations were found ample and judicious, and the wounded were speedily brought in from the field and skillfully attended. Regarding the operations of this department on the left wing, it is only necessary to remark that the orders given before the battle were strictly obeyed by the medical officers and their assistants, each one of whom endeavored with praiseworthy emulation to surpass the other in devotion to the wounded. Promptness and order characterized the action of the ambulance corps on this exciting day. So well was its duty performed that not a wounded man was left upon the field when darkness put an end to the conflict. On the 14th December, the troops remained on the field. The surgeons continued their labors, and on the evening of that day, comparatively few important operations remained to be performed. On the 15th, in compliance with orders of the commanding general given late on the preceding night, the wounded were removed to the north side of the river. The hospitals were ready, and the propriety of leaving them standing was now apparent. Before 6 o'clock in the evening, all the wounded were safely transported to these hospitals where everything was prepared for their reception. Some delay occurred early in the day in removing the wounded from the city in consequence of an order having been misunderstood. This was soon remedied, and long trains of ambulances might be seen crossing the river, halting in the city to receive the sufferers, then wending their way over the upper bridge to the hospitals of their respective divisions. After the last train had left, the city was thoroughly examined by my direction to prevent any wounded man being left. During the night of the 13th, the wounded of the 1st Corps were removed to their respective division hospitals on the north bank of the river. The wounded of the 6th Corps were removed on the 14th by 1 o'clock in the afternoon to the hospitals prepared for them before the battle. A portion only of the ambulances of this corps were engaged in this duty, the remainder being held in readiness in the event of a renewal of the battle which might occur at any moment. The movements of this wing of the Army required the removal of these hospitals still farther to the rear. The wounded were safely and comfortably lodged during the night. About 5,000 were removed to the north side of the river. The transportation of this number in the short time allowed, without accident and without confusion, under the belief that the enemy would open his guns upon our troops who filled the city, was a sufficient test of the efficiency of the system, and the manner in which it was carried out reflected the highest credit upon the officers in charge and afforded great satisfaction to the generals in command. Having been directed to send these wounded to the general hospitals in Washington, I began their removal on the 16th of December and continued it from time to time until the 26th of that month, when the last were sent away. I was very anxious to pursue the same course toward the seriously wounded in this battle as I did with similar cases in the Battle of Antietam. Many lives have been saved by the establishment of the Antietam Hospital, and I felt convinced that such an institution would again produce the same happy effect. The tent hospitals were fitted up comfortably with all the necessary appliances, and the medical officers were taking the deepest interest in their patients. I represented the matter to the commanding general, but he desired me to send them away without any unnecessary delay. Soon after the action, the slightly wounded were sent in charge of medical officers to Aquia Creek Depot by railroad and thence by steamers to Washington. In the removal of the serious cases, the floors of the cars were covered with hay, upon which mattresses, beds, and bed sacks filled with hay were placed, and the patients carefully taken to the hospitals and put in the cars. In the very serious cases, the sufferers were not removed from the mattresses upon which they lay in the hospitals, but were carried by hand to the cars, whence they were removed in like manner to the transports, remaining undisturbed upon their beds until they reached Washington. A medical officer with an attendant and instruments, stimulants, and dressings was in each car, and when necessary, he accompanied his patients to Washington. Every care was taken of these men, who, in numerous instances, expressed with much feeling their gratitude for the kindness and attention of the medical officers who had done so much to make their transportation comfortable. I never saw wounded men so carefully removed, and I can safely say that no more suffering was occasioned than the severity of the wounds necessarily entailed. While the battle was in progress, and after it was over, nearly 1,000 men, no one of whom had a wound of any consequence, and many were uninjured, jumped in the cars and climbed on the top at the depot near Fredericksburg and went to Aquia Creek, 12 miles distant, where they knew no hospitals were established. Before the battle, strict orders had, at my request, been given to the guard at this depot to allow no wounded to get on the cars, but unfortunately the guard was worthless and permitted these men to go as fast as steam could carry them out of reach of the hospitals, which they knew had been prepared for their accommodation. These are the men who, in battle, run to the rear beyond even the sound of the enemy's guns and complain of the surgeons whom they assiduously avoid, lest their wounds should be found so trifling as not to prevent them from participating in the fight. These are the cowardly stragglers who abandon their colors on the field of battle for the slightest injury, and raise a clamor which unhappily to many are found to echo. How different those, whether slightly or seriously wounded, who have borne the burden and heat of the day. Rarely do they complain of want of care. On the contrary, expressions of thankfulness often escape their lips for the attention bestowed upon them. In this action, we lost another highly esteemed medical officer, Surgeon S.F. Haven, 15th Massachusetts, who was killed by a shell while advancing with his regiment to meet the enemy. Soon after the battle, the Army was visited by Surgeon General William Hammond and the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War, who, after examining the hospitals, expressed their entire satisfaction with the administration of the medical department. The troops returned to their former encampments, depressed by the defeat they had sustained. The efficiency of the Army was very much impaired, and as it might soon be called upon to meet the same enemy, it became all officers to use their utmost efforts to encourage and arouse their men to a healthy fighting tone. The care bestowed upon the wounded in this engagement exerted a very beneficial influence upon the morale of the troops, for they saw that if men did fall in a battle from which we gathered only the bitter fruits of defeat, the medical department had become more able than before to fulfill its important duty. There was no department which labored more diligently to obviate the evil effects of the late disaster. After every engagement, whatever the issue, every portion of an army is more or less disorganized, and in no one is the effect more seriously felt than in the medical department. After the wounded had been sent to Washington, I was engaged in perfecting the details of the organization which I had instilled in the previous autumn, carrying out measures for improving the health of the Army, such as those regarding the location and police of the camps, the food, cooking, and police of the men, the reestablishment of regimental hospitals, etc. We were now in the midst of winter, which in this latitude is exceedingly inclement, and it was uncertain whether the troops would remain stationary and make themselves as comfortable as their surroundings would permit, or whether they would again be called upon to try the strength of the enemy. In the latter event, it was impossible to conjecture when or where this would be done. It is very difficult to labor in such fog of uncertainty. Nevertheless, this department was in a short time fully prepared to meet any emergency. This gratifying result was in great degree owing to the manly, self-reliant feeling which pervaded the medical staff. These officers deeply felt that proper organization had made their labors more valuable than ever before, and that their department was increasing in usefulness after every battle. Stimulated by the worthy pride of having succeeded so well in discharging the duties which devolved upon them at Fredericksburg, the medical officers were conscious of their ability to accomplish still more in the future. And still more they would in many future battles, including Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and more. It's a pretty incredible report emphasizing, the morale boost that a well-run medical department provided for the wounded. It took, not that anyone wanted to be wounded, but it took maybe 1%, of the edge off of getting wounded. Soldiers felt better that they might be cared for. So it's just some remarkable documents that we've read, not only by Jonathan Letterman, but by his counterpart, Lafayette Guild. This was a lot of fun, Jake. I enjoyed this, really diving into the primary sources and getting a close look at them. What was one of your takeaways from this?
Well, I think it's amazing just that, Jonathan Letterman doesn't give us much in the way of contemporary reports, diaries, letters, but he does give us that memoir, and it is just an amazing piece of history to be able to read not only what he was doing at the time, but also his reflections just a few short years later about how he went about accomplishing the reform of the medical department in the Army of the Potomac. I think it's amazing to look at these reports, to look at these documents, to read them, to listen to them. In this case, for many of you, if you're still watching with us, and to hear it in their own words. It's one thing for you or I or any professor, history teacher to talk about these things. It's another thing to hear the actual words of those who were participating, who were making these changes, who were seeing this suffering, to hear their take on it. It gets us a little bit closer to historical understanding of what it was like to live through that time and what it was like ultimately to make these changes that are still really influential in our life today.
Wholeheartedly agree. I know I thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm sure we might do something like this in the future. So let us know if you liked it in the comments. If you liked the video, like the video, share it, tell your friends about it, and like us on all our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. We even have a podcast, Horrors and Healing, the Civil War Medicine podcast. You can subscribe to that wherever you get your podcasts, that features exclusive interviews that don't go up in video format. So there's even more content out there waiting for you. And if you want to support all of this content we're producing, consider donating to our Hope Through History campaign, which you can find a link to that in the comments or at civilwarmed.org/support. So thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm sure we'll see you all virtually before too long.